63-year-old Ezra Coleman stood in the dusty main street of Cedar Falls, Arizona Territory, listening to the harsh words of the townspeople as they gathered around the sick orphan boy, who had collapsed outside the general store. The child couldn't have been more than 12 years old, thin as a rail and burning with fever. But instead of offering help, the crowd was offering cruel advice. "Boy's got nothing but that old nag," sneered Harvey Mills, the town banker. "If he's smart, he'll sell it and buy himself some food before he starves to death. That horse ain't worth much anyway," added Martha Henley, the shopkeeper's wife. "Probably do the boy a favor to put it out of its misery and use the money for something useful." The boy in question was clutching the reins of a paint mare that was nearly as thin and worn as he was. The horse's ribs showed through her dull coat, and her head hung low with exhaustion. But there was still spirit in her dark eyes and loyalty in the way she stood protectively over the fallen child. Ezra had seen enough suffering in his 63 years to recognize it when it stood before him. He'd lost his own son to cholera 10 years ago, and his wife Sarah to grief 2 years after that. Since then, he'd been living alone on his small ranch, existing more than living, going through the motions of daily life without much purpose or joy. "What's the boy's name?" Ezra asked quietly, kneeling beside the collapsed child despite the disapproving looks from the crowd. "Tommy Brennan," replied Doc Wilson, the only person in the group who seemed genuinely concerned about the boy's welfare. "Been on his own for about 6 months now, ever since his pa died in that mining accident up in the hills. The horse was about the only thing his family owned." Ezra gently touched the boy's forehead, feeling the dangerous heat of fever that spoke of serious illness and prolonged hunger. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with sickness. "Easy, son," Ezra said softly. "You're going to be all right." Can't sell Belle," Tommy whispered, his small hand tightening on the horse's reins even in his weakened state. "She's all I got left of Ma and Pa. They said I'd starve without her, but I can't." The boy's voice trailed off as unconsciousness claimed him again, but his words hit Ezra like a physical blow. Here was a child choosing loyalty over survival, clinging to the last connection to his dead parents even as hunger and illness threatened to kill him. "Doc, can you take care of the boy?" Ezra asked, already making a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. "Of course," Doc Wilson replied. "But Ezra, the boy needs medicine and food, and he's got no money to pay for either, unless he sells that horse." "The horse isn't going anywhere," Ezra said firmly, gathering Tommy's unconscious form in his arms. "And neither is the boy." Harvey Mills stepped forward with a calculating expression. "Now Ezra, don't go doing something foolish over some orphan kid. That boy's got to learn to face reality. Keeping that worthless horse when he's starving is just sentiment, and sentiment don't fill empty bellies." Ezra straightened to his full height, and something in his expression made the banker take a step backward. "Harvey, I've got a different idea about what's foolish and what's not. Seems to me the foolish thing would be letting a child suffer when there are adults around who could help." "What are you saying?" Martha Henley asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected what was coming. "I'm saying the boy and his horse are coming home with me," Ezra replied simply, "and they're staying until he's well enough to decide for himself what he wants to do." The crowd erupted in murmurs of surprise and disapproval. Taking in a sick orphan was one thing, but taking in a sick orphan and his useless horse was quite another, especially for a man living alone on a modest ranch. "Ezra," Doc Wilson said gently, "that's a generous offer, but caring for a sick child is expensive, and that horse is going to need feed and veterinary care too. Are you sure you can manage all that?" Ezra looked down at Tommy's pale face, then over at the paint mare who was watching him with intelligent eyes, as if she understood that her young master's fate was being decided. "Doc, I've got enough saved up to handle whatever needs handling, and I've got plenty of space for a boy and a horse who need a place to belong." "But the boy doesn't even know you," protested Mrs. Henley. "You can't just take in a stranger's child like he's a stray cat." "Why not?" Ezra asked mildly. "Seems to me a child in need is a child in need, whether I know him or not." And that horse there has more loyalty in her heart than most people have in their whole bodies. That's worth something in my book," as Ezra carried Tommy toward his wagon, with Belle following close behind despite her exhaustion. He felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since losing his family, he had a purpose beyond just getting through each day. 2 weeks after Ezra Coleman had carried a sick orphan boy home to his ranch, the small house that had been silent for years was once again filled with the sounds of life. Tommy Brennan sat at the kitchen table, his color finally returning to normal after days of careful nursing, while Belle grazed contentedly in the pasture outside the window. The transformation in both boy and horse had been remarkable. Under Ezra's patient care and Doc Wilson's medical attention, Tommy had recovered from the fever that had nearly killed him. Belle, meanwhile, had filled out considerably on a diet of good hay and oats, her coat beginning to gleam with health and her spirit returning to bright alertness. "Mr. Ezra," Tommy said as he helped prepare breakfast, "I keep thinking about what those people in town said, about how I should have sold Belle to buy food. Were they right? Was I being foolish?" Ezra paused in his coffee preparation to consider the question seriously. "Tommy, what do you think? Do you feel foolish for protecting something you loved when it would have been easier to give it up?" Tommy looked out at Belle, who was playing in the morning sun like a young filly despite her years. "No, sir. Belle was the last thing connecting me to my family. Selling her would have felt like selling my memories of Ma and Pa." "Then you have your answer," Ezra said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes the most important things in life can't be measured in dollars and cents. Sometimes keeping faith with those we love matters more than keeping ourselves comfortable." Over the past 2 weeks, Ezra had discovered that having Tommy around had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. The quiet ranch that had felt like a tomb now felt like a home again, filled with questions and laughter and the simple pleasure of having someone to care for. "Mr. Ezra," Tommy continued, "I've been thinking about what I should do now that I'm better. I can't stay here forever, eating your food and taking up your space. I need to figure out how to take care of myself and Belle." Ezra felt his heart clench at the thought of the ranch returning to its previous silence. "Tommy, what if I told you there might be another option? What if I told you I could use a partner around here?" Tommy's eyes widened with hope and disbelief. "You mean stay here, permanently?" "I mean exactly that," Ezra replied. "This ranch needs young energy, and I need someone to teach everything I know about horses and cattle. Belle needs a permanent home where she'll never have to worry about where her next meal is coming from. Seems like all our problems could solve each other." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, clearly overwhelmed by the offer. "But Mr. Ezra, I don't have anything to contribute. I don't have money or property or anything valuable to bring to a partnership, son." Ezra said gently, "You've got something more valuable than money. You've got loyalty, courage, and a good heart. You chose to protect something you loved even when it might have cost you your life. That tells me more about your character than any amount of money ever could. But what about the people in town? They think I'm just a burden, someone who makes foolish choices." Ezra's expression hardened slightly. "Tommy, there are 2 kinds of people in this world. There are people who understand that some things are more important than money, and there are people who think everything has a price. You've already shown me which kind you are." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch house. Looking out the window, Ezra could see Harvey Mills and 2 other men from town riding up the path, their expressions suggesting this wasn't a social visit. "Looks like we're about to have company," Ezra said, standing and moving toward the door. "Tommy, why don't you stay inside while I see what they want?" Harvey Mills dismounted from his horse with the self-important air of a man who believed his wealth gave him the right to interfere in other people's lives. Behind him were Pete Johnson, who ran the feed store, and Walter Griggs, a local rancher known for his hard-nosed business practices. "Ezra," Harvey called out, "we need to talk to you about that boy you took in." "What about him?" Ezra replied, stepping onto his front porch but making no move to invite the men inside. "Well, it's been 2 weeks now, and folks are starting to talk," Harvey continued. "That boy's got no legal claim on you, and you've got no legal obligation to him. People are saying you're being taken advantage of by a clever kid who's figured out how to get free room and board. Ezra's jaw tightened. Is that what people are saying? Now don't get defensive, Pete Johnson interjected. We're just looking out for your interests. That boy could work for his keep if he's going to stay here. And that horse of his is just eating your feed without contributing anything. Walter Griggs nodded in agreement. Ezra, you're a good man with a soft heart. But business is business. If you're going to keep the boy, you ought to at least sell that horse and put the money toward his upkeep. Inside the house, Tommy was listening to every word, his heart sinking with each criticism. Maybe the townspeople were right. Maybe he was being selfish keeping Belle when Ezra was already being so generous. Gentlemen, Ezra said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that made smart men pay attention. I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? Harvey asked. The misunderstanding is thinking that Tommy's situation here has anything to do with charity or being taken advantage of, Ezra replied. Tommy's not here as my ward or my burden. He's here as my partner. The three men exchanged confused glances. Partner, Pete Johnson repeated. Ezra, the boy's 12 years old. What kind of partnership could you possibly have with a child? Ezra smiled, and there was something in his expression that made all three visitors slightly uncomfortable. The kind where his loyalty and character matter more than his age or his bank account. Tommy's shown me more about what it means to be a good man in 2 weeks than some people learn in a lifetime. But the horse, Walter Griggs protested. That animal's not worth keeping, and the feed costs are my business, not yours. Ezra finished firmly, and for your information, Belle's worth more than all three of your horses put together, because she represents something none of you seem to understand. What's that? Harvey asked skeptically. Loyalty, Ezra said simply. The kind that doesn't change based on circumstances or convenience. The kind that chooses love over profit every single time. Subscribe to help us keep bringing you these incredible stories from the frontier. 3 months after Harvey Mills and his companions had ridden away from the Coleman Ranch in confusion and frustration, the partnership between Ezra and Tommy had blossomed into something that surprised everyone who witnessed it. The boy who had once been dismissed as a foolish orphan clinging to a worthless horse, had proven to have an almost supernatural gift with animals and an intelligence that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Tommy stood in the training corral, working with a young Mustang that had been brought to the ranch by a neighboring rancher who'd heard about the boy's abilities. Belle stood nearby, no longer the thin, exhausted animal from 3 months ago, but a gleaming example of what proper care and love could accomplish. Easy, Thunder, Tommy said softly to the wild horse, his voice carrying the same gentle authority that Ezra had used with him during his recovery. Nobody's going to hurt you here. We just want to help you learn to trust. Ezra watched from the fence, marveling at how the boy seemed to understand exactly what each animal needed. It was as if Tommy's own experience of being frightened and abandoned had given him a special ability to communicate with creatures who had known similar trauma. He's got a real gift, said Maria Santos, the neighboring rancher who had brought Thunder to be trained. My husband tried for weeks to get near that horse, but the boy had him eating out of his hand in 3 days. Tommy understands what it's like to be scared and alone, Ezra replied. That gives him patience and empathy that most people never develop. The transformation in Tommy had been remarkable to witness. The sick, frightened child who had collapsed in the street had grown into a confident young man who carried himself with quiet dignity. But more than that, he had found his calling in working with animals who needed the same kind of patient healing that Ezra had given him. Mr. Ezra, Tommy called out as he successfully placed a halter on Thunder for the first time. I think he's ready to start learning to lead. Take your time, Ezra replied. We've got all day, and he's got the rest of his life to learn. The philosophy that had guided Tommy's recovery, that some things couldn't be rushed or forced, had become the foundation of their training methods. Word had spread throughout the territory about the ranch where a man and a boy could gentle the wildest horses and heal the most traumatized animals through patience and understanding, rather than force and intimidation. Their peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of a fancy carriage, pulled by two magnificent bay horses. The vehicle looked completely out of place in the rustic setting of the ranch, and both Ezra and Tommy watched with curiosity as an elegantly dressed gentleman stepped down from the driver's seat. "Mr. Coleman," the stranger called out, approaching the corral with confident strides. "My name is Charles Whitmore. I own a thoroughbred racing stable in California, and I've heard some interesting stories about the work you and your young partner are doing here." Ezra and Tommy exchanged glances before Ezra stepped forward to shake the man's hand. "Mr. Whitmore, what brings you all the way out here to our little operation?" "I've heard that you have an unusual approach to horse training," Whitmore replied, his eyes taking in every detail of the ranch with the practiced assessment of someone who knew horses. "More importantly, I've heard that your methods produce results that traditional trainers can't match." Tommy led Thunder toward the fence, the wild Mustang following him with calm trust that would have been impossible just days earlier. Whitmore's eyes widened with obvious surprise and admiration. "Remarkable," he said quietly. "I've been working with horses for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that." "Mr. Whitmore," Ezra said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" The wealthy horseman smiled. "I'm proposing a business partnership, Mr. Coleman. I have the most difficult horses in the country brought to my stable, animals that have been ruined by harsh training methods or traumatic experiences. I'm willing to pay top dollar for someone who can rehabilitate them." "How much are we talking about?" Tommy asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. "For exclusive access to your services," Whitmore replied, "I'm prepared to offer $50,000 a year, plus all expenses and the finest facilities money can provide." The figure was staggering, more money than Ezra and Tommy could have imagined in their wildest dreams. But as they looked at each other, both were thinking the same thing. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Whitmore," Ezra said slowly, "but we'd have to leave here. Leave our home and our neighbors who depend on us. You'd have to leave that old horse, too," Whitmore added, nodding toward Belle. "My facility only houses racing stock and breeding animals. There wouldn't be room for pets or sentimentally valuable animals." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. Leave Belle, the horse who had been his connection to his parents, who had suffered alongside him, who had shared in his healing and recovery. Tommy looked at Belle, who was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes that had seen him through his darkest moments. Then he looked at Thunder, the wild Mustang who had learned to trust because Tommy understood what it meant to be afraid and alone. "Mr. Whitmore," Tommy said quietly, "your offer is very generous, but I'm going to have to decline." Both Ezra and Whitmore looked surprised by the firmness in the boy's voice. "Tommy," Whitmore said, "perhaps you don't understand how much money we're talking about. $50,000 a year would make you one of the wealthiest young men in the territory." "I understand exactly how much money you're offering," Tommy replied, "but there are some things that aren't for sale. Belle isn't just a horse to me, she's family. And this ranch isn't just a place to work, it's home." Tommy walked over to Belle and put his arm around her neck, the gesture natural and full of love. "Mr. Whitmore, 3 months ago people told me I'd starve if I didn't sell Belle. They said I was being foolish to choose loyalty over money. But Mr. Ezra here taught me that some things are more valuable than money, and keeping faith with those we love is one of them." Ezra felt his eyes fill with tears as he watched the boy he'd come to love like a son make the same choice he'd made months earlier, choosing loyalty and love over financial gain. "Besides," Tommy continued with a smile that reminded Ezra of his own son, "we've got something here that your fancy stable could never provide. We've got neighbors who trust us with their animals, families who depend on us, and the satisfaction of knowing that every horse we help will go on to help other people." Whitmore shook his head in amazement. "Young man, you're turning down more money than most people see in a lifetime." "Yes, sir, I am," Tommy agreed. "But I'm keeping something more valuable than money. I'm keeping my integrity, my home, and my family." As Whitmore's carriage disappeared down the road, carrying news of the boy who had turned down a fortune to stay loyal to an old horse, Tommy and Ezra stood together watching their animals graze in the afternoon sun. "Any regrets?" Ezra asked gently. Tommy looked around at the ranch that had become his sanctuary, at Belle who had shared his journey from desperation to hope, at the Mustang Thunder who was learning to trust because someone had shown Tommy what trust looked like. "No regrets at all," Tommy said firmly. "After all, they said I'd starve without Belle. But you sold your prize stallion to buy medicine for me, and you brought me soup instead of lectures about practical choices. You taught me that the richest people aren't the ones with the most money, they're the ones with the most love." Ezra put his arm around Tommy's shoulders, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made choices based on love rather than greed. "Son, I think we're both pretty wealthy by that measure." As the sun set over the Colorado Territory, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, the Coleman Ranch stood as proof that some values are indeed more precious than gold, and that sometimes the best investment a person can make is in loyalty, love, and the courage to choose what's right over what's profitable. Please subscribe to help us continue sharing these stories that remind us what truly matters in life.